I am Dr. Craig Chalquist. This is the fourth video on Terrapsychological Inquiry, our research method, qualitative research method for understanding how deeply the world and the things of the outer world actually are a part of our own psychology. So in this video, I want to talk about managing something that we call ecotransference. So let me go into that term a little bit before we get into the management part. So in psychotherapy, and this comes from the psychoanalytic side of things, transference is a form of projection that happens in session. Now, most of us, when we think about projection, have kind of a perhaps simple understanding of it as what I don't like in me, I see in you, but not myself. So my dark side isn't accessible to me, but I project it onto you. And of course, projection does work that way, simple projection. So, and this can grip entire nations. And so when we put all of our own internal darkness and rapacity and other undesirable qualities onto immigrants and demonize them, that would be a national example of projection. And of course, politicians who are reactionary take advantage of that. So projection is also more complex. And to give you an example of how it happens in a therapy session where we call it transference, let's say that you're a psychotherapist and you're with your client and things seem to be going pretty well, and then suddenly they're telling you about something that happened to them during the week, and you make a comment to bring their awareness to some aspect of what happened. And to the best of your knowledge, it's not a critical comment. It's just, oh, have you looked at this piece of it, And then all of a sudden their face changes and they say, oh, great. Are you going to be critical of me too, like the whole rest of my family that beats up on me? And you think, wow, that's different. So what you've just done is inadvertently, you've triggered something in them that belongs more in them than it actually belongs in the session. So Karen Horney, the analyst, used the term externalization for this reason, that you touch a wound in somebody else and then it goes, and then if you get hooked by that, that's your transference, right? So it's a complex thing. That's why these days, analysts in particular talk about the transferential field. It's just full of these interactions that happen all the time. And, projection obviously isn't confined to therapy, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. It happens all the time in relationships too. So whenever some wound gets touched, some unhealed place in the psyche gets touched, and we have a reaction and we immediately put it on other people, that's a good example of projection. So we do this too when we deal with different levels of ecological wounding in our research work. And my sense is that advocates for the environment also run into this. In fact, I think that ecotransference, where we have triggered reactions from what's going on with our research, are actually far more common than we realize. But most of us leave it in the unconscious and we just experience it as symptoms like depression or anxiety or some kind of inner conflict. And when we're aware of it at all, we might assume it's just us. And in fact, we're reacting all the time to our environment and what's happening to it. So that's something to take note of. Now, ecotransference can be extremely intense, and it has to do with having almost overpowering emotional and physical reactions to some aspect of the ecological work that we're doing. We've studied this most in terms of damaged places and resonating to what has happened to a place that's been ecologically harmed and how that shows up inside of us, which makes sense when you think about it. We're not separate from the places that we're looking into or living or occupying or working in. So of course we react to them. So part of terrapsychological work is to bring this reaction to consciousness and deal with it that way. It's actually valuable for the research. So let me give you a couple of quick examples of ecotransference, and then I'll talk about managing it. So many years ago, I was living in a neighborhood where I went on long walks once a day, and there was this one area that I would walk through, and I noticed after a while that whenever I went through there, my emotions would go flat. And I would think, that's odd. It took me a while even to notice it. And, at first I thought it was just me. And then I noticed that because of the regularity of my walks, there was always this one area, and my feelings would just go dead. And so I began looking into what was happening in that area. And it turned out that if I had kept walking a few more blocks, I would have come to a place where a big healthy meadow, was being pulverized and pounded down into the shape of a golf course. There was asphalt going all over it, and so part of the surface of the land was actually being destroyed. So I suspect that the flattening in my feelings had to do with the flattening of that field. And as I mentioned earlier, these sorts of psychological resonances are actually far more common than we realize. So that's one example. Another example would be one of us, Sherry, who was doing terrapsychological research, was out walking outside in this one area, and she suddenly started to feel sick, physically sick. And it got to the point where she needed to go to the doctor and get checked out. So there was nothing in terms of any chemical contaminant poisoning her or anything like that, but that area was known for being a neck of the woods that was full of toxic mines all over the place, all these abandoned mines. And they had destroyed and poisoned pieces of the landscape. So once again, there wasn't a cause and effect physical reaction going on, but her psyche was registering something about the land that was wounded. So, as I said, this is a lot more common than we realize. A lot of activists, I think, might suffer from this. So those are a couple of examples. There are many more in the growing body of terrapsychological research. And in my book on Terrapsychological Inquiry, there are parts of the book that give examples of this as researchers go through the experience and then the different ways that they handle this. So I want to give you a couple of suggestions if you do this kind of work. And I think these would come in handy for ecological work in general, because as all of us who read the news and actually get out are aware, there are a growing number of very troubled and damaged ecosystems all over the planet, and the climate itself is changing. So the first thing is to realize that, and this is where individual psychology cannot help us, realize that one's reactions sometimes are about forms of pain or trauma or damage that are bigger than we are. They're not personal. They're bigger than us, and we're reacting to it. So terrapsychology busies itself largely with the fact that it's a psychology of the more than human, and as it gets into us. So just realizing that helps you understand that, oh, this isn't just me. This isn't just some weird thing that's bothering me. I'm actually legitimately resonating with something that's going on in the world. And that all by itself can be helpful. So that's the first suggestion. The second is, we don't do this work alone. When I first started developing my version of terrapsychology and terrapsychological inquiry, which is our research method, I spent 11 years exploring California. I did a terrapsychological study of the entire state, and that ended up getting published in the Animate California trilogy. And, being new at all this, I was kind of making it up as I went and seeing what worked and seeing what didn't. And I did have friends to talk to, friends and loved ones, so that was helpful. But in retrospect, I would have drawn on that source of support a lot more consistently and consciously than I did. When you think about the amount of ecological damage that's been inflicted on California for centuries by incoming settlers and squatters and 49ers and everybody else, the amount of resonating that I did was really intense for a long time, and I don't recommend repeating that experience. So that's why we always work in teams. So have a supportive team set up before you even start your research. It doesn't always end up being that intense, but you never know. So secondly, do a self-check on whether there might be a door open in your psyche letting in too much. And what I mean by this is sometimes we bring to the work unresolved old wounds that are kind of sitting in the psyche waiting to be triggered by something. So this is not to reduce the actual experience of ecotransference to a personal wound. It doesn't work like that. But what does sometimes happen is that something about the work triggers us. It triggers some old wound, it opens an old scar or whatever. So at that point, it's like being saddled with a double wound. It's not only your personal wounding, it's the place or whatever aspect of the world that you're working with, right? So then you need to take care of your own healing. That's what you need to do at that point. One other suggestion here, actually two, let me put it this way. So one suggestion is to take in that more than human trauma little bits at a time. Don't just swim in it, don't just immerse yourself in it, but do a lot of self-care and kind of open the door and shut it, open it and shut it, and do it that way. And then as you work that way, metabolize. I'm using a psychoanalytic set of practices to think about this. It's useful for this work too. You metabolize some of that trauma and then you alchemically turn it into your work. So you write about it, you present about it, whatever it is that you're doing for the study. Maybe you do some activism, whatever it is, so that you're taking what's going into you, you're digesting it a little bit at a time, and then you're turning it into a response. You're responding to what's been addressed to you. And that can move it and keep it going through you. And I want to emphasize a little bit at a time. Too much is too much, and sometimes you just need to take a break from it. So my last suggestion is to take time to celebrate your sensitivity. Because whether you're working with broken down neighborhoods, displaced people, old buildings, devastated landscapes, forests that need help, regenerative work, growing things, planting seeds, teaching people eco-resilience, whatever it is, when you come into those moments of deep resonance with the pain of the world, whether it's local or global, that's a precious gift to have. And just by being that open and receptive, you're actually making the world better.